Some melodies return long after the moment they were written, not as a promise, but as a memory the world wasn't ready to release. There are winters that take from us, and winters that give back in ways we never expected. A name spoken in a cold room, a box held carefully in shaking hands, two men who once walked beside him, now standing in the quiet he left behind. Grief moves differently when shared. It softens at the edges. It finds room to breathe. It let the truth rise between people who never thought they would meet. And somewhere in the stillness, a small melody waits, unfinished, unresolved, holding the echo of the boy who shaped all their winters. This is Winter's last melody, Chapter 5, the melody that belonged to him. The quiet inside Ren's workshop settled slowly, like snow choosing where to land. The door had been closed for a while, the heater clicking softly as it fought the cold. Two men, both shaken in different corners of the same room, tried to steady themselves again. Ren remained near the workbench, hands braced on the wood he trusted. Across the room, Itsuki wiped the last trace of tears from his face before speaking to his boss, apologetic, restrained, explaining the flights were suspended. When he hung up, neither man spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply delicate. Itsuki finally set his phone down and reached into his travel bag. His movements were careful, deliberate. Wrapped in a soft cloth, he drew out a small wooden object, the music box he had carried for years. Ren's eyes shifted the moment it touched the workbench. Recognition flickered. The stubborn way Haru's early work always held tiny imperfections like the fingerprints. Itsuki unwrapped the cloth fully. "It broke a while ago," he said quietly. Ren reached forward, fingertips brushing the cranked hinge, the loosened gears. Ren exhaled once, the sound small, almost warm. "I can fix it," he said. The relief in Itsuki's postures was subtle but clear. He nodded, stepping closer to watch Ren examine the inner mechanism. "Haru gave it to me," Itsuki said. Ren paused only a breath, and then nodded once, gently. The workshop light softened over the broken box. Snow pressed lightly against the window as Ren began to work, and the silence between the two men shifted. No longer heavy, simply shared. Ren worked in silence at first, not out of avoidance, but because the music box demanded a kind of attention that left no room for haste. He spread a clean cloth across the workbench, placed each tool in a precise line, then lifted the lid again with a gentleness that made Itsuki's breath ease without him meaning to. The gears inside were shifted. One screw had nearly worn through its thread. The hinge had split cleanly at the seam, a break that said more about years than neglect. Itsuki watched quietly from the opposite side of the workbench, hands folded in front of him, his trouble coat still hanging off one shoulder. He didn't lean close or hover. He just stood there, as if staying still might keep the memory from slipping. Ren lifted the hinge, tested the give, then reached for a fine-headed screwdriver. "We were in the same club," Ren said. "Craft work, instruments." He stayed late a lot, tried too hard most days. Itsuki absorbed that slowly, just listening. Ren adjusted the tiny gear, rotated the axle, and set it down. "He gave you this?" he asked. Itsuki nodded. "A long time ago." Ren's hand still for a moment, barely a pause, before he continued soothing the worn edge of the wood. Another silence followed, softer this time. Ren straightened, lifted the lid gently, and tested the tension of the repaired hinge. It held. Itsuki let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Ren didn't smile, but something eased in his shoulders. "Thank you," Itsuki said quietly. Ren simply nodded. Two men standing over the same memory, letting the room warm around them inch by inch. Itsuki sat down first, the repaired music box resting in his hands, as if it were still fragile. Ren joined him a moment later, the heater's soft hum filling the room with a steady, muted warmth. Neither spoke. Itsuki brushed his thumb over the lid, once lightly, then lifted it. The first note was small, tentative, almost shy, a thin chime that wavered as though remembering how to exist. The sake-filled cup sat untouched beside them. Ren reached for one cup, paused, then looked at Itsuki. "You want to finish the sake?" he asked. Itsuki let out a breath, a small one, almost a laugh without the sound. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." Ren poured slowly. Their first sip was quiet, the warmth spreading gently through the cold edges of the room. For a while, they said nothing, not out of discomfort, but because the night didn't ask for noise. Itsuki's fingers drifted back to the music box, tracing the smooth edge of the lid. He hesitated. "You knew him well?" he said quietly. Ren set his cup down, fingers brushing the wood of the table, grounding himself, steadying the place where memory threatened to rise. Then in a voice just above a whisper he spoke. "There was a time when Haru and I were close." And the night finally began to open. The sake warmed slowly between them, thinning the cold that had clung to their shoulders since the funeral. Pieces of their story surfaced gradually, the quiet way Itsuki's gaze lingered on the box, remembering a time when Haru had placed it in his hands, that they had known Haru in different time. Ren's memories came from youth, long hours in workshop rooms at the university. Haru frustrated with tools he barely understood, the brightness that drew people in before he ever realized it. Itsuki carried a later version, a steadier Haru, softened by experience, more deliberate in his warmth, less unsure of where to place his affection. Two separate histories, never meant to overlap, now sitting side by side in a quiet winter workshop. The sake moved them closer to the truth. Haru had changed between their lives, and yet somehow, he had remained himself. It wasn't an exchange of stories. It was a quiet alignment, a winter truce settling into place. Morning came quietly, as if unsure whether to touch the night they had left behind. The storm had blown itself out in the early hours, leaving Otaru wrapped in a soft blue-white stillness. Snow clung thick against the workshop windows. Ren stepped out first, boots sinking into a new snow with a muffled sound. The cold met him cleanly. He exhaled, breast turning white in the morning air. Itsuki followed a moment later, pulling his coat tighter around himself. His eyes scanned the pale sky, the thin line of sun lifting slowly over the distant houses. The world felt quieter than the night before. A small radio near the door murmured weather updates from inside the workshop. Roads partially cleared, buses running again, trains expected to resume by afternoon, airport still closed. Itsuki listened without reacting. He had already accepted he wasn't returning to Tokyo today. Ren closed the workshop door gently, locking it. The repaired music box was wrapped, carefully, and tucked in Itsuki's bag, resting between spare clothes and a few crumpled papers. A memory now whole again, waiting for its place. Itsuki looked toward the street, toward the snow-covered car waiting under a soft drift. "Shall we say hello to Haru?" Ren nodded once. There was no hesitation in either of them. Not in the way they moved toward the car. Not in the way Ren brushed the snow from the windshield. Not in the way Itsuki held the bag a little closer, as if aware of its gravity. They weren't returning for themselves. They weren't returning for closure. They were returning because Haru's memory asked for it. Ren started the engine. Itsuki settled into the passenger seat. The drive was almost soundless. The heater filled the car with muted warmth, but neither Ren nor Itsuki spoke. The morning seemed to ask for quiet, and they honored it. They passed a turn toward the temple district. Itsuki noticed, but didn't question it. He understood intuitively, the way one recognized a truth without words, that the funeral wasn't a place for what they carried. Funerals were for farewells spoken in public. What they held wasn't public. Haru's body lay at temple for visitors, condolences, rituals. But his life, the piece that shaped the boy they each knew, lived in BA, in the fields, in the farmhouse, in the quiet corners of BA he had never stopped returning to. Snowfields unfurled on both sides of the road. Ren had driven these passes in younger years, back when Haru would insist on taking the long route, so they could talk about nothing and everything at once. Itsuki had never been to BA, but the landscape felt strangely honest, as if it held something Haru had never been able to say aloud. Ren slowed the car as they approached the familiar wooden fence. The farmhouse stood still in the morning light, a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, the field stretching wide and untouched behind it. They stepped out into the cold. Itsuki stood still for a moment, taking in the quiet. They didn't walk toward the house right away. Instead, they wandered the grounds, following the shape of fences, the storage shed. Ren walked ahead at first, boots sinking into snow with a muted crunch. Itsuki trailed a few steps behind, his gaze drifting across the field, as if trying to imagine Haru's footsteps layered beneath the snow. The farm held its own kind of silence, not mournful, but familiar, like a place that had waited through many winters for someone to return. Every now and then Ren paused to look over the land. Itsuki stopped near the old swing frame, half buried in snow, its rope stiff with frost. He didn't touch it, only watched how the light landed on the seat, wondering if Haru had once sat there, legs kicking forward under the summer skies. It felt right to walk first, to breathe this air. They rounded the side of the house, boots leaving thin trails behind them. The snow muffled everything, their steps, their breath, the soft creak of distant branches, until the silence felt almost protective. Only then did the farmhouse door open. A farm worker stepped out, bundled in a thick jacket, rubbing his hands for warmth. He looked surprised to see visitors, scanning them for a moment. Ren lifted a hand in greeting. "We're Haru's friends," he said quietly. The worker's expression shifted, not shocked, but softened by recognition of the funeral, of the few who might come today. "Yes, please come in." He stepped aside, holding the door open against the cold. "The family is still at the funeral hall," he said gently. "But they told me, if any of Haru's friends came by, you're welcome to look around, especially his room." Itsuki lowered his head, a quiet thank you forming in the small movement. Ren nodded once, breeze drifting in the cold air. They followed the worker across the porch, toward the warm light spilling from inside, toward the place where Haru had lived. The door closed softly behind them. The farmhouse interior held the warmth of a place used daily. The worker led them to a short hallway and stepped back, nodding toward the second door. "That's Haru's room," he said softly. "Everything's as he left it." Then he returned to his chores, leaving Itsuki and Ren alone. Ren pushed the door open first. Haru's room was the room of a man who had settled into a quieter season of life, the life he chose after years of drifting. The bed was neatly made, blanket corners tucked with a habit formed through a routine rather than careful appearance. A single pillow, slightly indented. A folded sweater at the foot of the bed. Itsuki stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the space with a reverence that came from seeing the version of Haru he never fully knew. The Haru who returned to his farmhouse, year after year until it became where he stayed. Ren's gaze found the bedside table almost immediately. The music box, the odd, uneven sculpture-like piece he had crafted in university, sat there. A thin layer of dust softening its edges. Ren didn't touch it, but his breath shifted, quiet and contained. Itsuki paused near the wooden rack. A familiar winter coat hung there, the one he had sent Haru during a cold Tokyo season. Not new anymore. The cup slightly worn, the color muted from use. Haru had worn it. Often. Everything spoke quietly of life and motion. One Haru had been living fully, even if gently, even if privately. Ren took a slow step deeper into the room. Itsuki stayed near the doorway, each taking a different side of a life Haru had built after drifting out of theirs. There was no dramatic realization, no tears, only a room that felt real, immediate, and warm. A space that made Haru's absence sharper, and yet strangely comforting. This was the version of Haru the world saw last, the version who had finally chosen a home, a rhythm, a steadiness, a man neither of them fully knew, but both recognized. Ren's shoulders eased. Itsuki's breast steadied. The room didn't feel empty. It felt paused. Haru's room held them gently, the way quiet places sometimes hold grief for people who don't know how to place it. Ren stood near the bedside table, Itsuki near the desk, neither rushing, neither trying to fill the space with words. It felt wrong to move too quickly, and equally wrong to linger. Itsuki reached into his bag and lifted the repaired music box, wrapped still in the cloth Ren had used the night before. His hands were steady, not trembling, not unsure, simply respectful. He crossed the small room, each step soft against the warm wooden floor, and stopped at Haru's desk. There was enough space cleared at the center, a natural gap among the notebook and the farm logs, as if this was where Haru might have placed something he meant to return to. Itsuki kept his hands on the cloth for a moment, before letting it fall open, and placed it on the desk. He stepped aside. Ren watched from a few steps away, breath slowing in a soft, steady rhythm. The gesture didn't startle him. It felt right, as though the box had finally found its way back to the place it had been meant to rest. Ren approached then. He didn't reach for the box either. He only stood close enough that the melody seemed as if it could rise if either of them wanted it. Ren lowered his head slightly, a gesture small yet full, as if acknowledging the years between the boy he once knew and the man who lived in this room. Itsuki gazed softened at the coat hanging, worn, used, loved in a way he'd never been told, but could now plainly see. For a long moment, they simply stood there, not remembering the same Haru, not grieving him the same way, but honoring him side by side in the space he last called home. When they finally stepped back from the desk, the room stayed warm, as though Haru was still walking its edges. They stepped out of the farmhouse together, boots meeting the cold with a soft, steady crunch. The door clicked shut behind them. The winter air felt different now, not harsh, not biting, just clean. The kind of cold that met you with clarity rather than weight. Ren pulled on his gloves while Itsuki adjusted the strap of his bag. Their movements unhurried, shaped by a calm that had settled into them only minutes earlier. The yard stretched open before them, covered in a thin layer of fresh snow. Their earlier footprints crossed the ground in wavering lines, looping around the barn and the side paths where they had walked before being invited inside. They started toward the car at the same time. The snow underfoot grew firmer near the parked car. "I can take you to Sapporo Station." Itsuki nodded. "Thank you. That would help." Ren opened the door. The heater hummed softly as the engine started. Snow shifted beneath the tires. As they pulled onto the narrow farm road, the farmhouse shrank behind them, becoming a warm square of light in the white. And slowly, gently, the snowfall erased their footprints. Some melodies don't end when the hands that made them are gone. They stay. In the room they once filled, in the people who carried them forward, in the quiet place where love was left unfinished. A winter can hold many stories, the ones we shared, the ones we were too young to understand, and the ones we return to only when the world grows still enough to listen. For Ren and Itsuki, this winter was not a beginning. and not a second chance. It was a soft, unbroken truce that loving someone leaves a shape in us, and carrying the shape is its own kind of grace. The snow will fade, the roads will open, their lives will move again. This was Winter's last melody, Chapter 5, the melody that belonged to him. And though this story closes here, more stories wait beyond this winter. Please like the video and subscribe to Gay Audiobooks. Thank you.